A Japanese macaque sits on the concrete floor of her enclosure, a navy crayon gripped in her fist, like a child who has never been taught how to hold one. She presses it against a sheet of craft paper and pulls it sideways in a single long stroke. Then another crossing the first at an angle. Then a third shorter, pressed harder. She does not look up. Beside her, propped against the cinder block wall, is a stuffed bear, small cream-colored one, ear flattened from years of being held in the same position. The bear has no name tag, no brand label visible, just a patch of fur worn down to the fabric at the left shoulder. Through the window at the far end of her enclosure, the slope of Primate Hill is visible, 20-30 macaques moving through the trees in the late afternoon light, unhurried, belonging to each other. Pan does not look at the hill. The keeper on the other side of the observation glass watches without moving. She has been watching Pan draw for 8 months. She still does not know what Pan is drawing. Pan sets down the navy crayon, picks up a gray one and adds a single curved arc near the top of the page, deliberate, unhurried, like someone finishing a sentence they started a long time ago. The keeper leans slightly forward. Pan does not look up. 4.5 years earlier, on a rainy night in March, Pan arrived into a world that did not hold her. The rain hit the roof of the zoo building in flat percussive sheets and made the drains run loud. It was 3 in the morning, and the indoor macaque unit at Minato Animal Park was quiet except for the rain and the restless movements of the troop shifting in their sleep. Minato Animal Park sat on a low coastal ridge in Chiba Prefecture. The hill was called Primate Hill, and on it lived a troop of 60-odd Japanese macaques who moved through the trees and terraced rock faces with unhurried confidence. The indoor unit at the hill's base was a different world, climate-controlled, fluorescent-lit, smelling of cleaning solution and warm animal. It was where animals went when they needed more than the hill could give them. Pan's mother delivered her on the floor of the indoor enclosure at 2:47 in the morning, quickly and without complication. The mother held the infant for less than 40 minutes before she put her down and moved away. The troop did not intervene. The infant lay on the floor of the enclosure, wet and very small, making the high, thin sound that means, "I do not know where I belong." That sound, unanswered long enough, becomes a different kind of silence, the kind that closes a door that cannot be reopened. Daichi Mori was 27 years old, in his second year as a keeper at Minato Animal Park, the only staff member on overnight duty that night. He was not a specialist in primate care. He had no protocol for the silence that follows an unanswered, lost call, nothing written down that told him what to do next. He went in anyway, still in his keeper uniform navy. The standard issue with the amber-banded cap pushed back, and picked the infant up carefully and brought her to the small preparation area adjacent to the enclosure. He found a feeding bottle. He warmed the formula with the focus of someone doing a task they cannot afford to get wrong. The infant Pan took the bottle. She drank with her eyes half closed, not looking at Daichi, just drinking. Daichi sat on the floor of the preparation area and held the bottle steady. The rain continued outside. He did not go home when his shift ended at 6. He called his supervisor at 7:15, his voice careful and factual. His supervisor told him to keep the infant warm. Daichi said he would. He stayed. In the days that followed, the veterinary team discussed options, including transfer to a specialist facility in Kanagawa. The transfer was reasonable. Daichi asked for 72 more hours. He did not make an argument, he just asked. The 72 hours became a week, and the question of transfer quietly stopped coming up. Pan was alive. Pan was gaining weight. Pan had decided that Daichi's hands were the ones she would accept. When other staff tried to take the bottle, Pan turned her head away and made a low sound, not quite distress and not quite calm, a sound that said, "Not that, not yet, not them." Pan transferred everything to Daichi. He was there in the morning when she woke. He was there in the afternoon when she slept against his shoulder, her grip on his sleeve loosening only gradually as sleep deepened. He was there at the bottle and at the quiet moment after, when Pan would sit in the crook of his arm and look at the middle distance with an expression that keepers sometimes describe carefully as contentment. On the 11th day, Pan reached for the bottle herself. Not with perfect coordination, her grip uncertain, but with clear intention, both hands closing around the plastic. Daichi let her take it. He sat very still, his hands open on his knees, and watched her hold the bottle and drink from it without his help. He looked down at his open hands for a moment, then back at Pan, and his expression was the expression of someone who has just understood something they did not have words for yet. The stuffed bear arrived on day 14. A cream-colored bear small enough for an infant macaque to carry, brought in by one of the veterinary nurses. Pan ignored it for 2 days. On the third day, she picked it up. She held it against her chest with one arm, the same grip she used on Daichi's sleeve, and did not put it down again. The bear's left shoulder began to flatten within the first week. Pan grew from an infant who needed to be held through the night into a young macaque who could cross the enclosure on her own, climb the rope structures, pick food with quick, deliberate fingers. She remained Daichi's through proximity, through the particular quality of her attention when he entered the corridor, through the way she settled when he sat down nearby and unsettled whenever he left. Daichi arrived each morning, and Pan already knew he was coming. Before the door opened, she would orient toward the corridor, still listening a second or two before his footstep was audible to anyone else. From the window at the far end of her enclosure, Pan could see the slope of Primate Hill, the troop moving through the trees, grooming each other on the flat rocks near the summit, the juveniles chasing each other down the terraced paths. She watched the hill sometimes in the afternoons, when the light was good. She did not watch it with longing. She watched it the way you watch something that does not quite concern you. Daichi was there. The hill was not necessary. The transfer order arrived on a Tuesday when Pan was 2.5 years old, and it was not addressed to Pan. It was addressed to Daichi. The zoo system in Japan moves keepers on a rotation. Daichi's posting was to a wildlife rehabilitation center in Hokkaido, 4 hours north by train. He had 2 weeks' notice. He spent those 2 weeks doing everything the same way he had always done it: the morning, feeding the afternoon. Check the long, quiet hours in the observation area. Pan did not know what 2 weeks meant. She knew the morning smell when Daichi arrived and the sound of his particular footstep on the corridor floor. On his last day, Daichi stayed past the end of his shift. He sat in the observation area and watched Pan move through the enclosure in the late afternoon, climbing the rope structure, carrying the bear from one corner to another. The light through the high windows moved slowly across the concrete floor. Outside, through Pan's window, Primate Hill had gone quiet, the troop settling into the trees for the night, the hill becoming a silhouette. Pan did not look at the hill. She looked at the corridor door briefly, then back at the bear in her hands. Daichi watched her. He stayed until 7:15. He left the way he always left, standing, collecting his jacket from the bench, walking to the corridor door. He walked more slowly. He stopped at the door and looked back once, not at Pan, but at the enclosure as a whole, at the window and the darkening hill, and then went through the door and let it close behind him. Pan did not look up. She was still sitting with the bear in her lap when the door clicked shut. Before he left the building, Daichi stopped in the small restroom at the end of the keeper corridor. The narrow room behind the indoor macaque unit, where staff kept spare uniforms, where someone had put up a shelf for tea things years ago. One wall held a loose arrangement of photographs that had accumulated over the years, keepers with animals, moments nobody had planned to document. He added one photograph to that wall. Navy uniform, amber-banded cap pushed back, Pan, 6 weeks old, perched on his left shoulder with Momo tucked against her chest, his face turned slightly downward toward her. Daichi smoothed the corner of the photograph against the wall. He did not look at it again before he left. The restroom had one small window set high in the wall. On certain mornings when the angle was right, a pale stripe of light fell from that window across the corridor floor outside. Pan could see that stripe from the front of her enclosure. She did not know what it meant, but she faced it the same way she faced the corridor door, with the same quality of waiting, the same stillness, the same patience that had no object. The next morning after Daichi left, Pan sat at the front of her enclosure for 2 hours, facing the door. Not pacing, not vocalizing, just sitting with the bear held against her chest, eyes on the place where footsteps came from. The keeper who arrived for the morning feeding was not Daichi. Pan took the food. She went back to the door and sat down again. Yuna Hashimoto was 24 years old, 3 months into her first full posting as a keeper at Minato Animal Park. Pan simply turned her back when Yuna entered with a completeness that felt less like animal behavior and more like a decision. She would accept food from Yuna's hand briefly without eye contact. She would tolerate Yuna's presence during enclosure checks, standing at a precise distance, watching with an expression that was very still and very difficult to read. The months that followed were quiet, the quiet of a space where something was missing. Yuna tried everything. Pan accepted everything Yuna offered and gave nothing back. She carried the bear everywhere. She watched the corridor door. She watched the pale stripe of light from the restroom window when it appeared on the corridor floor. It was in Pan's 3rd year, 8 months after Daichi had left, that the park launched its Creative Engagement Enrichment Initiative. Non-food materials on a rotating schedule, woven grass fabric scraps, clay. And on the 3rd week, large sheets of craft paper and crayon colors set out in a shallow tray. Most animals investigated the crayons briefly and moved on. Pan did not move on. She picked up the navy crayon first, not the brightest, not the most novel, the navy one, and she looked at it for a long time before she pressed it to the paper. Yuna was at the observation glass when it happened. She was watching Pan with the clipboard still in her hand when Pan made the first mark. A single long stroke pulled sideways across the craft paper. Pan stopped. She looked at the mark, 3-4 seconds of complete stillness. Her head tilted, and then she pressed the crayon down again, crossing the first mark at an angle. She did this several more times, the navy strokes building and crossing in the lower portion of the page. Then she set the navy crayon down and reached for the olive one. She moved to the upper left area of the page and began to trace a shape there. Smaller, rounder, built up from circular overlapping strokes, pressing the olive crayon with concentrated deliberateness of something being remembered rather than invented. The olive shape sat in the upper left of the page above the navy mass, smaller, separate, resting on top of it, the way a small creature rests on a shoulder. Yuna lowered her clipboard. Pan sat back on her heels and looked at what she had made. She reached for the amber crayon and pressed a single small mark in the upper right area. Isolated from everything else, 2 or 3 short parallel horizontal strokes, deliberate. She set the amber crayon down. She reached for the gray crayon and drew a single curved arc across the top of the olive shape, one continuous stroke pressing firmly like a brow or a cap brim or horizon. She set the gray crayon down. She looked at the paper for a long time. Then she picked up the bear, tucked it under her arm, and walked the enclosure perimeter twice before settling in the corner to sleep. Yuna stood at the observation glass for a while after Pan had settled. She photographed the drawing before the evening clean. She did not know what she was looking at. She kept the photograph anyway. The enrichment rotation continued, and each time the craft paper and crayons returned, Pan went immediately to the navy crayon and began. Always the same composition, always the same sequence. The drawings accumulated in flat file folders at the keeper station. She showed them to the veterinary staff, who noted them as repetitive mark-making, not unusual in primates. Yuna did not find this wrong. She just did not find it complete. She looked at the drawings often. The months passed, and Pan drew on enrichment weeks, and Yuna watched and nothing resolved. It was a Tuesday in November, nearly a year and a half into her posting, when Yuna first went into the restroom at the end of the keeper corridor. She had been looking for a spare set of enclosure keys. The room was narrow and smelled of old wood. A shelf with tea things, spare uniforms on hooks, a single high window letting in a stripe of afternoon light. On the far wall, half in shadow, a loose arrangement of photographs pinned and taped at different heights. Most of the photographs she could not identify. One photograph stopped her. A young man in a Navy keeper uniform, amber-banded cap, pushed back on his head, sitting in the preparation area adjacent to enclosure 7. A macaque, very young, perhaps 6 weeks old, perched on his left shoulder, a cream-colored bear tucked against her chest. His face turned slightly downward, his expression the expression of someone paying close attention to something small. Yuna stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she went to the keeper station and retrieved the most recent drawing from the flat file and carried it back to the restroom and held it up beside the photograph on the wall. The navy mass filling the lower portion of the drawing. The olive shape in the upper left resting above the navy. The amber mark isolated in the upper right. The gray arc across the top of the olive shape. She looked at the photograph. The navy uniform filling the lower portion of the frame. The small macaque on the left shoulder higher up, separate. The amber band on the cap. The line of the cap brim curving across the top. Yuna lowered the drawing slowly. She stood in the narrow room, the drawing in her hands, the photograph on the wall. The stripe of light crossing the floor between them. Something shifted in her chest. Not quite grief and not quite recognition, but something that contained both. She turned the photograph over, carefully pinned, not framed. On the back, in small, slightly compressed handwriting, Pan's name, a date from nearly 3 years ago, and below that one sentence. She read it once. She stood with it. Then she pinned the photograph back exactly where it had been turned off the light and went to the personnel filing cabinet to look for a name. She found a forwarding contact, an institutional email address for the rehabilitation center in Hokkaido, and she sat with it on her screen for a long time before she typed anything. She was not sure this was the right thing to do. She was not sure it was permitted or wise or kind. Not sure whether bringing Daichi back would give Pan something she needed or reopen something that had begun to close. She knew what happened to animals who bonded deeply and then lost that bond and then had it returned and taken away again. The second leaving could be worse than the first. She also knew that Pan's drawing sessions had been getting shorter. Pan setting the crayon down before the composition was complete, sitting with the bear in a stillness that had weight in it. The veterinary team had noted it too: reduced engagement with enrichment materials, mild changes in appetite, no clinical cause found. Yuna had read that report and then sat with it and then read it again. She thought about Pan sitting at the front of her enclosure every morning facing the door. She thought about the stripe of light on the corridor floor and the way Pan watched it. She thought about the drawing, the photograph, the sentence on the back in Daichi's handwriting. She typed the email. She did not copy her supervisor. She sent it at 11:47 at night, sitting at the keeper station desk with the overhead light off and only the screen illuminating her face, and then she closed her laptop and went home. Daichi replied at 6 the following morning, 4 sentences. Yuna read it standing in her kitchen with her coat still on, then sat down at the table without taking her coat off and read it again. She called the number he included, and he picked up on the second ring, and they spoke for 22 minutes. She drove to meet Daichi on a Saturday morning when she was not scheduled to work. She met Daichi at the station. He was taller than she had expected from the photograph. He carried a small bag. He did not ask many questions during the drive, just looked out the window at the coast road along Chiba Prefecture, the sea visible in gaps between the buildings, gray and flat in the November light. At the zoo gate, Daichi stopped walking for a moment. Not long. Then he continued. The indoor macaque unit smelled the way it always smelled. The layered warmth, the cleaning solution, the faint metallic note of the ventilation system. Daichi walked slowly. He passed enclosure 5, enclosure 6, his breathing slower, more deliberate. Yuna stayed a step behind and did not speak. At the far end of the corridor, through the narrow window of the restroom door, the stripe of afternoon light lay across the floor exactly as it always did. Pan was drawing. She was at the far side of her enclosure, her back to the observation glass, the navy crayon moving across the craft paper in its familiar pattern. The bear was propped against the wall to Pan's left. From where Daichi stood at the glass, he could see only her back. The dark fur, the slight forward hunch of concentration, the movement of her arm as the crayon moved. He did not tap on the glass. He did not speak. He stood, and the quality of his standing was the quality of someone who has learned that stillness is its own kind of signal. 7 seconds passed. Pan's crayon stopped. Not a gradual slowing, a stop. Mid-stroke, the crayon still pressed to the paper, her arm arrested. Her head came up. Not toward the glass, straight up, attending to something in the air that Yuna could not detect. What Pan could detect was a specific combination of molecules, The soap, the outdoor cold, the particular human warmth she had pressed her face against hundreds of times at 3 in the morning. Pan knew. Before she turned, she knew. She was still for 4 full seconds, her arm extended. Crayon pressed to paper every part of her, attending to a single signal arriving through the air. Then she turned. She turned slowly, her body rotating from the hips in the careful way of an animal approaching something. It wants very much and is afraid of getting wrong. She saw Daichi. She stood still. 1 second, 2, 3. She picked up the bear from where it was propped against the wall. One fluid motion, the arm sweeping out and returning with the bear pressed to her chest and crossed the enclosure. Not running, walking fast with the directness of an animal that has made a decision. She reached the glass and pressed both hands flat against it, palms open, looking up at Daichi's face. Daichi stood for 1 moment with his arms at his sides. Then he raised his right hand and pressed it flat against the glass from his side, his palm covering both of hers. Pan made a sound, low, sustained, built in the back of the throat, the sound she had made as a newborn when she did not know where she was. It was very quiet. Yuna was standing 2 steps behind Daichi. She watched his reflection in the observation glass, both palms flat against the surface, and then his shoulders dropped, released. Pan pressed her forehead against the glass. Daichi pressed his forehead against the glass on his side. The glass between them was perhaps 12 millimeters thick. They stayed like that. Yuna looked at the floor and did not try to measure how much time was passing. When she looked up, tears were running down Daichi's reflection, and he was not wiping them, just standing with both hands on the glass and letting them run. Pan had shifted back slightly and was looking up at him with an expression that had no clinical name. Something older and quieter than relief, a recognition that had never needed language. Yuna looked at the floor again. She understood that the closeness she was being allowed, Pan not turning away, was not directed at her. She was close because Daichi was close. Daichi stayed for 2 hours. He sat in the observation area, and Pan sat on her side of the glass, and they were simply near each other. Outside, through Pan's window, Primate Hill had gone the particular gold of late November afternoons, the troop visible on the upper rocks. Pan did not look at the hill. She looked at Daichi. Pan drew for a while, easy-focused the navy crayon moving in its familiar rhythm. Daichi watched with his arms crossed and his shoulders slightly forward. When it was time for him to leave, he stood from the observation bench the way people stand when they do not want to stand, but have decided that they will. Pan watched him stand. She picked up the bear. She watched him walk to the corridor door. She watched him open it. She watched him go through it. The door closed. Pan stood at the glass for a while longer, the bear against her chest, her eyes on the place where Daichi had been. Then she turned and walked back to her drawing. She picked up the navy crayon and looked at the page. She set the navy crayon down. She picked up a different one. Yuna was still in the corridor, her back against the wall, watching through the glass. She saw Pan choose the crayon. She saw Pan move to the right side of the page to the space she had always left empty and begin. The marks were different. Shorter, lighter, built from lines that curved rather than crossed, that gathered rather than radiated. Yuna moved closer to the glass. Pan worked slowly, her fist moving in small, deliberate arcs, building up a shape in layers. The shape that emerged was smaller than the navy mass. In the lower portion, its lines tentative. Not uncertain, just careful the way you draw something. You are still deciding how to hold. Pan sat back on her heels and looked at what she had made. She reached for the gray crayon and added a small curved arc near the top of the new shape, the same arc she always drew last. Smaller now, placed differently. She picked up the bear and held it loosely in her lap, not pressed to her chest, just resting there, her grip easy. She looked at the drawing. Yuna looked at the drawing. Pan reached out and touched the smaller shape lightly with one finger. Not drawing, just touching the surface of the paper, and then withdrew her hand and sat still. Outside, Primate Hill had gone dark, the troop invisible now, in the trees, the hill only a shape against the sky. Pan did not look at the hill. She looked at the drawing. She picked up the navy crayon and added one careful stroke to the composition, finishing what she had started before he arrived. Two shapes on the paper now, the large one complete. The small one to the right still open at the edges, its gray arc not yet drawn. Pan set the navy crayon down. She looked at the drawing for a long moment, then tucked the bear against her side loosely. Then she picked up the gray crayon. She continued to draw,